until recently, everyone was arguing, if only women were ruling, ruling countries, wars wouldn't happen and so on. Well, that's obviously nonsense. I had people come and meet me from his presidential apparat, and they met me, and they asked me even to write a report, just a one-pager for a certain personage, about who was Potemkin and how did he take Crimea. I treat the royal family of Benin the same way I would treat the Habsburgs or the Romanovs.
Hello, my name is Mikhail Ziger, and every week I'm speaking with the unique guests. And today I'm going to interview Simon Sebag-Montefiore, one of the best historians alive, and probably the most popular historian in the United Kingdom, right? Congratulations with the new book.
Thank you very much.
And also congratulations with the recent news from Kherson. We're speaking just a few days after Kherson was taken by the Ukrainian army. And amazingly, you happen to be probably the best specialist on the history of that city and on the history of Russian colonization of Novorossiya and Crimea, because of your marvelous book about Catherine the Great and Potemkin.
Yes.
Why is that? Not everyone understands why that city is that symbolic and that important in terms of history of Russian colonial empire. Can you explain that?
Well, Kherson is so important to the especially to the Putin view of Novorossiya and Russian colonization, because it was the first Russian city created by Prince Potemkin in 1778 in his newly won territories. And the idea was that Kherson, named after Chersonesus, the Greek city, was going to be a new capital, a new great metropolis. And of course that didn't happen because the port wasn't good enough. And it was later superseded by other cities that he built, Mykolaiv, Dnipro, then called Yekaterinoslav, and others, and ultimately Odessa. But basically, it was the beginning of his vision for a new Russian empire. And what's fascinating about it was, of course, southern Ukraine then wasn't Ukrainian. These were Islamic. This was Islamic territory ruled by the Tatar Khanate of Crimea, and also many cities were controlled and territory was controlled by the Ottoman sultans. So they were conquering this territory, and then they were creating these new towns, these new cities. And of course these are the cities that are now being fought for on the southern front of the Ukrainian war. So that's why it's very important. But I also think, you touched on it yourself when we were talking, was that Potemkin is a figure who is not terribly well known, ironically, in Russia. Russia, which is very strange because he's the only figure in the entire period of over 300 years, over 3 centuries of the Romanov dynasty. He's the only non-Romanov who was really royal character, who really had royal status and was as important. He was more than a minister. He was a partner. And I think it's true to say he was the greatest minister, greatest a politician and statesman of the entire Romanov dynasty period.
Is it right to call him like the father of Russian colonial imperialism?
Yes, I think he was. I mean, his vision was, part of it was called the Greek project, and that was to take Byzantium, to take Constantinople, and to make it Tsargrad, to make it into a sort of Russian a city ruled by Catherine the Great's younger grandson, who was called Constantine, specially for this reason. But more immediately and realistically, it was just to take southern Russia. To take southern Ukraine, rather, and to make it Russian. But to do that, they had to create cities. They had to colonize it and settle outsiders there, because there was no one there then. There were a few Tatars. There was a small community of Cossacks, the Sech, near Zaporozhye, and the rest of it was Islamic, was populated by Tatars and Ottomans. And so his vision was to create a new fleet, the first southern fleet on the Black Sea that Russia ever had. Peter the Great had founded the Baltic Fleet, and Potemkin founded the Black Sea Fleet. And the other part of it was to create a naval base there. And of course that would be Sebastopol, which Potemkin built and founded. And he did all these things, but the settlers weren't particularly Russian and Ukrainian. They were actually many Poles, many Jews, which is very unusual for this period, Greeks, Italians, French, as well as Russians and Ukrainians. So overall, it was a unique vision, but it was a very different vision, a much more cosmopolitan vision, a vision of the Enlightenment. It wasn't a sort of narrowly nationalistic vision that we are seeing today. So it was very different from Putin's sort of ultra-nationalist authoritarian Russia.
Can you explain that difference? Because I saw you once said that Potemkin would have despised what Putin is doing.
Well, Potemkin came from a period of when royalty was everything and aristocracy was everything. So it was a very aristocratic period, a very aristocratic vision of the world. And people like Potemkin and Catherine had as much in common with other aristocrats in other countries in Europe. They were Europeans and were very proud to be Europeans. They were in correspondence with D'Alembert and Diderot and Voltaire.
And actually, Voltaire urged Catherine the Great to conquer Constantinople from Turks.
That's right. So, the Enlightenment was this kind of rationalist, more tolerant, less religious superstition, and it suited very well with Catherine and also with Potemkin. And they were highly clever, highly cosmopolitan people. They were children of the Enlightenment, which was a very, very different thing. It was pre-nationalistic, but they would have hated ultra-nationalism. They were regarded as vulgar, but also base, and they would have been against it. So they were also, obviously they were huge imperialists, and they saw the world in terms of empires, and they wanted to create a bigger Russian empire. So, one has to be careful that, they were definitely Russian imperialists. There's no doubt about that. And they could be very ruthless with people that crossed them or challenged Catherine's throne, for example. I mean, for example, they were pretty ruthless at putting down the Pugachev revolt.
They were very ruthless to the Ukrainian population.
They were very ruthless to some of the population.
Serfdom in Ukraine before Catherine, and
they brought in serfdom. Yeah. But equally, they were much more humane. I mean, when Potemkin took great cities like Ochakov, there was a huge massacre when he took it. But that was the rules of war in those days. If a city didn't surrender, you were allowed to storm it, and that was understood. Not to apologize for the massive massacre, but that was the rules of international war at that time. Of course, this is another era, and we don't approve of that. But on the other hand, Potemkin was always keen to avoid warfare at all, and always keen to look after his troops. I mean, these people 300 years ago were much more humane than the rulers of Russia today. I mean, obviously, the rulers of Russia today are the heirs of the Bolsheviks, who were incredibly merciless. He wrote endlessly in his letters about how to save lives, how to look after his troops, how not to need to fight at all. And then, of course, he loved foreigners. He loved the British. He offered George III to lend a Russian army to put down the American Revolution. So, but they loved everything that was English and French. So they wanted it. They wanted English and French art, English and French advisors, English and French gardeners, and all of this sort of thing. So it was a much more sort of cultured world, imperialist, but they would have absolutely hated everything Putin is doing, and his brutality, above all.
Do you understand why Russian troops took the the corpse, like the bones of Potemkin from his grave in the cathedral.
Well, it's very interesting because, when I wrote that book, Catherine the Great and Potemkin, my first history book, all those years ago, it was interesting because when I went to the archives in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they were virtually untouched, except for one scholar had been in there for years laboring there, but otherwise no one had written about it. And this is because Stalin gave the guidance that, Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, these male, ruthless male statesmen were suitable for the Bolshevik, was for the Bolshevik reform from above, if you like, or revolution from above. Well, Catherine the Great was a woman, and she and Potemkin were too decadent, too debauched, too cosmopolitan as well, and too aristocratic. And therefore, even though Stalin talked a lot about Catherine the Great and Potemkin, including with Yuri Zhdanov, the son of his top leader, Andrei Zhdanov. He talked to me. He said, "What was the genius of Catherine the Great? The genius of Catherine the Great was Potemkin." So he was very interested in the period, but no one studied it under the Soviet Union. And hence, when I published my book, very weird thing that an English writer should be advising unofficially and indirectly, but should be advising the new president of Russia about Potemkin. But that's what happened.
You had a phone call from...
Not a phone call from him, but I had people come and meet me from his presidential apparat, and they met me, and they asked me even to write a report, just a one-pager for a certain personage about who was Potemkin and how did he take Crimea and southern Ukraine. So this was very interesting at the time, because I was like, how can they not know about it? But the answer is that academic life and teaching ignored Potemkin, as you pointed out, and so I received benefits from this because I received a message through my publisher, who was Vladimir Grigoriev, who was the deputy culture minister of Putin. That Putin was very happy with this, and as a result, I could be the first to work in Stalin's archives, which was very useful for me because I wrote a book about that. So the point is that Potemkin is the link between now and then, and much of the historical case that President Putin puts now for Russian ownership of Ukraine is very tenuous. I mean, Kievan Rus is extremely obscure. Actually, we know virtually nothing about it, and there's really no direct connection between that and sort of 17th and 18th century Russia. So Potemkin is the real link. Actually, these territories, southern Ukraine, were only conquered by Russia very recently, in the 1780s, basically, which is the time of the founding of America. And the person who founded all these cities was Potemkin. So Putin, about 2 or 3 years ago, Putin suddenly started mentioning Potemkin, but also Suvorov, Ushakov, these paladins but they all worked for Potemkin, actually. And so when he started to mention them all, I was like, oh my God, this is very strange, because this links me back 20 years to that period. And so when he took Kherson, the body of Potemkin is there, and I never thought they would steal the body, but it's the strangest thing, because no one was going to touch that body. I don't believe that the Ukrainians would ever have bothered with it. And of course, I'd visited that tomb back in 20 years ago when I was researching the book. I was in the tomb of Potemkin, looking for the body of Potemkin, and in St. Catherine's Church in Kherson. So a reason why I think they've taken the body is because it's a direct link between Russia and this territory. And if you regard all the Kievan Rus stuff as basically kind of nonsense, really, without real connection to modern times, Potemkin is a direct link. And so I suspect that they're considering something with the body, to bury the body somehow in a tomb in Moscow or something. And you can imagine a tomb with the names of all these cities conquered for Russia, 1778, 1783, Crimea, Mykolaiv, Mariupol, Dnipro, all these are the cities that he founded. So that would be a kind of, the body in the tomb would be a kind of historical justification. So I think that's why they've taken the body.
You've started as a historian focused on the history of the empires.
Yes.
But your recent book is very unusual. It's very unusual for the historian, and it's very ambitious because that's the history of the whole world from the perspective of the family stories. And at the same time, what thrilled me is that you are focusing simultaneously on different countries, on America, Britain, and France, as well as Kenya, Indonesia, India, or Peru, or and you equalize the importance of different cultures and different civilizations and different families as well. Do you think that that approach in the global history is needed? That people are overestimating their own national history and pay much less attention to the history of the world? And is it a problem?
Yes, I think it is a problem. And when you see too much of it, you see, I mean, Britain itself is incredibly Anglo-centric and obsessed with itself. It used to be obsessed with saying how brilliant everything British was, and now it's obsessed with saying how awful everything British is. We see in Russia, when nationalism harnesses a sort of distorted history, what happens. So I think that the more people study other countries and other cultures, the better. I mean, obviously, the great thing about with my idea for a world history. The book is called The World, A Family History, and it's through families linking up all the different civilizations, kingdoms, and different continents through all of time. And the great thing of doing it through families is that it's a very neat way to be very extremely diverse, to treat Africa and Asia the same way we treat Europe. It's also great because the great thing about a family is it includes women and children who are often ignored traditionally from histories. But the third thing, which I also am very proud of and which you've touched on, is that this isn't just the victor's history. In other words, it doesn't just have the British Empire and the Russian Empire and the Genghis Khan Empire, though they are all there. It should also cover less known countries. I mean, so this is truly global. We have Dahomey and the Zulus, we have the Cambodians, the Haitis, the Haitians, the Hawaiians, Kenyans, Moroccans, and these are all countries that are normally left out of world histories. And I think that history was originally created in all of our countries, in Russia, in Britain, was created in the 19th century by nationalists, to help create, to help contribute to an idea of a nation state. Which was based around the nation that had this ancient history. And so, obviously, history has improved since that period. But this is the next step, where we look at history, we look at other histories as well, and we treat them all the same. One of the things about this book is I treat an African family the same way I treat a European family. I treat the royal family of Benin the same way I would treat the Habsburgs or the Romanovs.
I liked also, or probably that was my illusion, but unlike many historians, you don't seem to, if not respect, but you are not taking your characters too seriously.
No.
You are not pretending that they were super smart and they were right in their decisions. You're not trying to look for some logic, but sometimes there is a feeling that they are very human beings, and they are ruled by sex, by some mistakes. The title of the chapter about Catherine the Great is the quotation of
Frederick
the Great, the rule of cock and cunt.
Yes.
Is it deliberate? Are you trying to like diminish the traditional heroes?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I mean, I think we've moved beyond a history of kind of great men and great women too. You know, and the women are also very relevant to today, because until recently everyone was arguing, you know, if only women were ruling countries, wars wouldn't happen and so on. Well, that's obviously nonsense. You know, you have to look at Russian history to see that.
There was a century with Maria Theresa and
and there was a century in Russia when, you know, when it was virtually female ruled in the second half of the 18th century. I mean, I've done that deliberately. I mean, partly I think history books, they have to be read by people, and so they should be entertaining and well written as possible. And so I worked very hard to make sure that my books are readable by people and actually accessible to everybody. So you don't have to sort of know any history to read these books. And that's part of it. And the other part of it is deliberate. Yeah, I mean, these are people that if you'd known them, you'd have known their mistakes, their frailties, their flaws. And yes, some of them all made appalling mistakes. Most of the ones we know about were very able, but they were also very lucky. And then of course there are all the peccadillos. There's the sex. There's the the bad temper. There's all the things. There's the favourites. So there's all the things that one sort of forgets about. But if one knew them, if one knew them in real life, one would know all these things. And I'm trying to give as much as you can the feeling of these people as they really were, with all their strange characteristics. Because character is still very important in history. I mean, we see that most dramatically in our own times with Trump, for example, and his kind of presidency, or with President Putin. You know, the decisions of very few people, a tiny group of people, as you've written, you know, made the decisions that have changed the world recently in Ukraine.
We're talking a lot. I mean, that part of Russian society that is trying to reconsider what's happening with us. We are talking a lot about de-imperializing of Russian history, because we don't have any other history but the history of Russian Empire that proved to us or to our ancestors that like the empire is the biggest value.
Yeah.
How did it happen in Britain? Was there a long process of de-imperialization of British history?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting because in Russian, first of all, it's fascinating. You know, everyone in the West is furiously studying the crimes of the British Empire, for example, academia, and yet all these people, these thousands of people who are sort of studying this subject, completely ignored, you know, a very vibrant Russian Empire that still continued with an imperialism that was completely current. So that's an interesting irony, of course, in itself. And yeah, I mean, I think with British history, there was a process for a long time. There was great resistance to changing anything in Britain, and we were taught, for example, that, you know, Britain abolished the slave trade, and this was a great success. But we were never really taught that Britain dominated the slave trade beforehand. And in a way that diminished the achievement of abolition too. And in fact, the more you reveal, the more you shine and illuminate, you shine light on the reality of the past without any structure of ideology, the more powerful it is. And that's what I've tried to do in my book. You know, in my book you see the British Empire without any gilding at all. You see it as it is: crimes, achievements, everything. But you also see it alongside the Russian Empire, the French Empire, for example. So you see it in context. But recently, in the last sort of 25 years, you've seen in academia and in history a slow but sure and speeding up decolonization of British history. I think a lot of it is good, but it can also go too far and then just transform into another form of self-obsession and Anglocentricity, which removes and denies the agency to people of other lands. That's one of the things I'm trying to correct in this book, is just to show Peru and India and Cambodia and so on, to show how they ran their own lives. They had full agency, even at times when the British were ascending, British powers ascending or French powers ascending. So I think it can go too far, but in Russia it's a particularly strange phenomenon, because Rossiya was kind of created by Peter the Great as an empire, and the conception of self in Russian nationalism was always linked to a sort of empire with a sacred mission to the outside world to spread the empire. And of course then we saw that changed given a different Marxist focus under the Bolsheviks, and now it's returned again, the sort of strange sacred nationalism of today.
But is it possible at all to heal that obsession if the imperial nation is obsessed with its role in history and with its historical mission? It's obvious that British society is focused on its history and its role, as American society is focused on its history. For Russians, other histories do not exist.
Yeah.
And there is the unique path of Russia, and the world is spinning around Russia.
It's very hard to, as you put it, cure it. It's very hard to cure it if everyone believes in it and everyone wants to believe in it, as seems to be the case with the majority of people in Russia even today. I mean, obviously vast numbers of people, including you, have left Russia. Those are probably the people who are skeptical of this idea of Russia as a sort of global, messianic global mission. And of course it's troubling that this is continuing today in the 21st century in Russia. But obviously, it's impossible to cure it unless enough people want to within the country, within academia, and we're not seeing that in Russia today. You know what's happening there now more than I do, but it doesn't seem that way, not yet. But sometimes it needs some massive humiliation to change the view. In Britain, it was the Suez Crisis in 1956. That really sort of suddenly made Britain realise, with an international humiliation, luckily without too much bloodshed, that the British Empire was no longer a power, and that Britain had to rethink its role in the world, and maybe Ukraine will be that experience for Russia today.
You've spent a lot of time in Russian archives. Searching for materials about Stalin, and you know quite a lot about Stalin's inner circle and about all those Politburo members and all those titans that surrounded Stalin. When you are watching the news right now, and when you're watching Putin and his inner circle and all those people, do you recognize the atmosphere, types, the relationships?
Yeah, I mean, you recognize some types. I mean, what the difference is that Stalin really did have power for instant life and death over his inner circle. And though, as we know, there are some very strange deaths in the upper reaches of Russian business these days. Not all of them can be accidents, but actually, there isn't any evidence yet of Putin actually executing his top people, as far as I know. there've been assassinations abroad, but he hasn't started.
There are no real purges.
There are no blood
the elite,
purges.
yeah.
There are no blood purges in the sort of leadership, in the elite, not yet. And even real enemies are sent to camps, or sent to prisons, but not yet. But not yet actual sort of arrests among the inner circle. So there's no blood purge, you're right. So that is a big difference. But obviously when you see the fear, when you see the formal meeting just before the invasion, I immediately thought of those Central Committee meetings in 1937 and 1952, those big Central Committee meetings where everyone denounced each other, everyone was terrified. I mean, what is recognizable is the fact of people desperately trying to show loyalty, to accuse themselves, to accuse others, the atmosphere of looking for enemies of the people, for looking for traitors. I mean, all of this is straight out of 1937 and is straight out of Stalinism. So there's all of that. And of course, the top leaders do all look terrified. And there are real parallels. I mean, for example, Shoigu really reminds me of Voroshilov, in the sense that, because he's not a real general.
Yeah.
He's obviously a sort of good-natured guy who is a key figure in the regime. Partly because of his longevity in the leadership, and as everyone knows, basically doesn't understand military matters at all, and yet is kind of essential sort of protection for the leader, and so there are real parallels.
Who's Khrushchev?
That's the thing. We need to find out who is Beria and who is Khrushchev.
Yeah.
I mean, there were several Berias, of course, Zolotov, and others perhaps. Naryshkin and Patrushev, they are sort of probably the Beria figures, and yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think. We need to find out who the Khrushchev figure is, of course.
That's someone whom no one takes seriously.
Someone who no one takes seriously. So that could be Medvedev, for example, because we laugh about him right now. He's a joke. I mean, it could well be him, but he has been president. So in certain situations, he's proved his loyalty as an extremist, just as Khrushchev did in Kiev in 1938 as party leader in Moscow during the war. So he showed himself to be more Stalinist than Stalin, and yet that made him able to embrace reform. So someone like Medvedev could surprise us all. That's the point. He's a joke now, that's for sure.
Okay, there is a strong belief in Russia, and especially outside of Russia, that everything is going to change when Putin's gone. Just like, or unlike it happened after Stalin's death. Because after Stalin's death, yes, everything has changed, and the situation became better. But still, it took almost 40 years for the regime, for the system to collapse.
Yeah.
Do you expect that period?
It's possible. I mean, obviously, historians are useless prophets, as we know. But yeah, I mean, I think that Putin's rule may well end with his death in some way or other, and that's the only way it can change, or a coup d'état, which, of course, we know from Russian history is possible. And there are plenty of examples. My books are full of examples of these different sorts of coup d'états. Some bloody, like the killing of Peter III and Paul I. Some bloodless, like the coup against Khrushchev in '64, and against Gorbachev, of course, by Yeltsin. So there are lots of different ways this could happen, and none of us know how that's going to play out. But you're absolutely right that the regime may not end with Putin, and it could well last, as the Stalin regime did. Everything changed, but nothing changed. And in fact, it took 40 years. So we may not get Russia back in our lifetime.
I was amazed that in your recent book, in your new book, describing Ivan the Terrible, you named the chapter Goida and the bloodthirsty animal.
Yeah.
And like you took the word that is now being used, and it has been used by the prominent actor during the rally on the Red Square.
Yeah.
What do you think of that historical parallel? That the slogan of the oprichniks is being used in patriotic objective.
Well, I mean, that's also fascinating. So the authoritarian government today is reaching back to all these parallels, and the oprichniki is just one of these. It's just one of these parallels that are being mentioned. And the fact is, every authoritarian government needs an oprichniki, and of course, that's what makes these governments extremely hard to overthrow. And this is why Russian governments are virtually never overthrown by popular protests. I mean, I think Nicholas II is really the only one, and that was really a coup. That was really a coup by the army, in effect, because it was the army that actually told him he had to go. You're thinking of.
I'm thinking of 1991.
Yeah.
That was not the overthrow by popular protest.
Not
but,
really,
yeah.
but it was a yes.
But the coup was unsuccessful due to the popular protest.
Due to the popular protest, it was foiled by popular protest. But I think the point is that it's very rare in Russian history. We're arguing about two cases here, and I think that and this is because these states, especially in Russia, are expected to have and make sure they do have huge security apparatus, which, provided they remain loyal, are very hard to overthrow by popular protests, because they're willing to use the deadly lethal force. I mean, Nicholas II is the most interesting example, because he won the 1905 rebellion. He put down the 1905 revolution in the end because the Guards regiments remained loyal to him, which is what they were designed for by Peter the Great, 200 years earlier. But in fact, they were all wiped out at the front in the Brusilov offensive. And so when 1917 came along, Nicholas II had no Guards regiments. In effect, they'd been decimated. And so, I mean, even his sort of loyal forces actually very quickly fraternized with the crowds, and then joined the revolution. So, as long as Putin doesn't lose all his Rosguardia and other special forces, as long as they don't get completely mauled in Ukraine, which they are beginning to be mauled, aren't they? But as long as they remain protected, the regime will not fall that way, will not fall from popular protests.
Probably the final question I've got is about the future, because I love to say that history is the rehearsal of the future, because we don't have any other.
We have no
other tool to watch the scenarios.
But it's a very unreliable rehearsal. That's the problem.
Yeah.
It's a very unreliable.
Yes.
It's a very rough rehearsal.
Definitely, but it's a rehearsal of possible scenarios, not.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
of course.
We don't know.
Yeah.
We know that it's not going to happen again.
Yeah.
But we see that a lot of nations have huge historical traumas from their colonial past.
Yeah.
You worked in Ukraine. You know a lot about the Ukrainian colonial trauma. You worked in archives in Georgia and Armenia while preparing for the book about Stalin, about young Stalin.
Yeah.
How long can it take to cure all those national traumas of post-Soviet nations?
It can take a long time. I mean, I think it can take a long time. I mean, one thing that's clear is that, the fall of the Soviet Union is still going on. And it's not a complete fall, because, of course, the Russian Federation is the Russian Empire by another name, and it is still a sort of colonial empire. And as long as that state continues, there's going to be a crisis between the periphery, the states, these new small states, the periphery, unless they become more powerful. I mean, the only way that this is solved, in a sense, is the idea that Pilsudski had and talked about, which was these states would be powerful armed states, large proper states. And Putin, in a sense, has ironically accelerated that now, because Ukraine is now going to be a massively powerful military state. It's going to be a war democracy, and that will change. That will be one step. Ultimately, that will be a step towards curing, the Russian view of itself as an empire and only an empire. But it takes a long time. It takes a long time.
But if Russia is not the empire, does it mean that it's gonna be disintegrated?
Possibly. I mean, it could become a properly federal state. It could break up. I mean, I just think one's got to realize that historically, many of these countries that we think of now as kind of immutable, eternal, perpetual states are actually very recent. The United States was only created 300 years ago, just over 200 years ago. The Russian Empire, as we know it in Europe, is 18th century. It was created in the 18th century. And that's the meaning that's why Potemkin is especially significant now, as is Peter the Great. But they are the two most significant statesmen of that period. And this Russia that we know today has only existed since 1720s, and its empire, and having the whole of Ukraine and Poland and all these things is again very late 18th century, as as every Russian knows. So it could, it's not going to be around forever. And my history of the world, my book, The World, A Family History, is filled with the rise and fall of states and empires, and they're not perpetual. And even among the great winners, they never win for long. That's the lesson.
That would be another question, but my complaint. I really miss the peaceful figures in Russian history.
Yeah.
I think that we don't have all the traditional heroes,
yes,
which are glorified in Russian history, are
soldiers,
mostly bloodthirsty monsters.
Yeah.
Even Peter the Great, even Suvorov, who is considered to be the great soldier, but most of his wars were, most of his battles were like repressive battles against uprisings.
Yeah.
We don't have.
You only have the poets.
Family. We have literature.
Yeah, you have literature.
Yeah.
And of course, they are, even Pushkin is also very imperialistic. Even all of those great writers. But still, you have these amazing writers. You have the great poets. You have they're the great heroes. As Mandelstam said, they so respect poetry here, they kill you for it. But you're right. I mean, this is a parade of paladins, of conquerors. And of course, Peter the Great is the most interesting in many ways, because he set an incredibly high standard for all rulers of Russia, because he was everything. He had all the gifts of a leader. He commanded his own army at Poltava, for example. Every single Tsar and General Secretary and President of the Russian Federation since then has fantasized about being able to do that. And not one of them have really been able to do it, of course. But all the Tsars wanted to. Nicholas II was dying to take command of the war against Japan. Stalin regarded himself as a great strategist. Though, by the way, he did improve, unusually for someone of that type of personality. He actually learnt how to be a supreme commander during the war, which is quite extraordinary. So while Hitler got madder and madder and more deluded and more rigid and more dogmatic, Stalin went the other way. I mean, after losing such massive such massive losses that no other leader in history could have survived that, but because he'd killed all potential opposition, he survived. But then in 1942, after a series of further disasters in Kharkov and other places, he started to listen to his commanders and actually became a ruthless but quite able political supremo. So that's an interesting journey. We haven't seen Putin make that transition yet. And it'd be interesting to see if he ever learns to be a proper supreme commander, or whether he becomes more like Adolf Hitler, becomes ever more interfering, dogmatic, and calamitous for Russian forces. We'll see.
Your new book ends with Putin's invasion to Ukraine.
Yes.
Do you consider it to be somehow the end of history?
Not the end of history. I don't use that. I see it at the beginning. I see it as the reversion to traditional history rather than the end of history. I mean, I think that the last 70 years was a special period of order, such as never been really seen in the world before. And we just need to realize how unique it was that we lived in that period when there were rules. I mean, not that everyone listened to the rules, of course, and many compromises were made. Not least, we compromised to allow the Soviet Union to rule Eastern Europe, for example. That was a big compromise. But the end of that period is now upon us. And as I write in the book, normal disorder has returned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you for your time.